Thesek found Yuna in the small garden that the humans had created in an unused cargo bay. A patch of green growing things that reminded them of the worlds they had lost. She was sitting on a bench with her metal cane resting across her lap. Her face turned toward the artificial sunlight that the humans had installed to help their plants grow. He approached slowly, his scales scraping against the floor in the distinctive pattern she had learned to recognize. And when he stopped a few meters away from her, she turned her head toward him with the calm expression he remembered. "I know who you are," she said. "Thesek of the Vorn clan. You remember my name. I remember the sounds you make when you move. And I remember your voice." Thesek stood in silence, all the words he had prepared dying in his throat, in his culture. The defeated presented their vulnerability to the victor and accepted whatever judgment followed. But he was not here to present his throat, and she was not his conqueror. And he did not know what ritual or custom applied to this situation. "You are scared," Yuna said suddenly. The observation struck him like a physical blow because she was right, and he had not expected her to perceive it. "Yes," he admitted, the word strange on his tongue. "Why? I do not know," he said. And that was honest, even if it was incomplete. "I came here because something has been wrong inside me since that day in the corridor. And I cannot sleep, and I cannot eat properly, and the feeling will not leave me alone." Yuna's expression did not change, but something in her posture softened slightly. "What you are feeling," she said. "Does it make you want to undo what you did?" Thesek considered the question carefully. "I cannot undo it," he said. "The cane is gone." "That is not what I asked." He was silent for a long moment, wrestling with concepts that his language and culture had never taught him to express. "Yes," he said finally. "I wish I had not done it, and I wish I could take it back. And I do not understand why I feel this way, because in my society, the strong dominate the weak, and there is no regret for victory." "But you do not feel like you won?" "No." Yuna nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something she had been wondering about. "What you are feeling," she said, "humans call it guilt. And it happens when we do something that hurts another person, and our conscience tells us it was wrong." Conscience. The part of you that knows the difference between what you can do and what you should do. Thesek had never heard such concepts explained this way, and he found himself listening intently, desperate for understanding. "In my culture," he said hesitantly, "there is no word for what you describe. That does not mean the feeling does not exist. How do I make it stop?" Yuna smiled slightly, and the expression contained something that Thesek could not identify, something that looked almost like sympathy for his confusion. "You cannot make it stop by pretending it is not there," she said. "The only way through guilt is to face what you did and try to become someone who would not do it again. I do not know how to do that. Neither did I when my parents died, and I had to learn how to live without them." Yuna said, "But I learned, and you can learn too." Thesek felt something release in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. "Why are you being kind to me?" he asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "I destroyed your father's gift, and I laughed while doing it. And I wanted to hurt you because you refused to kneel. You did hurt me," Yuna acknowledged. "But hurting you back would not undo the hurt. And staying angry forever would only make me smaller. And I do not want to be smaller." She paused, her blind eyes seeming to look directly at him, even though he knew she could not see. "Someone told me 3 words after you broke my cane," she continued. "A man who understood darkness because he had lived in it. And those words changed how I see everything." "What words?" "Never stay broken." Thesek repeated the phrase to himself, turning it over in his mind like a strange artifact from an alien world. "I think you are starting to understand that you broke something inside yourself that day," Yuna said. "Not just my cane, but something in your own spirit. And now you have a choice about what to do next." "What choice?" You can stay broken and become someone who hurts others forever, she said simply. Or you can learn to build instead of destroy and become someone different. Months later, Counselor Mavis stood before the Galactic Council and presented her report on the newest species to reach the stars. She described what she had witnessed on Threshold 7. The blind orphan who refused to be defeated. The veteran who transformed his trauma into craftsmanship. The community that responded to cruelty with presence rather than violence. She described a young Valtteri, who now spent his days in a repair shop, learning to fix things instead of breaking them, guided by patient hands that could not see but understood how to build. We have misunderstood humanity, Mavis told the council. We measured them by their technology and their physical capabilities and their short lifespans. And we concluded they were unremarkable, but we were looking at the wrong things entirely. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Humans break, she continued. Every species breaks when faced with enough pressure. But humans possess something that I have not found in any other species in 3 centuries of observation. And that is the absolute refusal to stay broken. They rebuild, she said. Not just their structures and their technologies, but themselves, and they help each other rebuild. And they even help their enemies rebuild when those enemies are ready to change. The council listened in silence as Mavis finished her presentation far away on Threshold 7. A blind girl walked through the corridors with her unbreakable cane tapping a steady rhythm against the floor beside her walked a young Valtteri who was learning that strength did not come from dominance, but from the courage to become something better than what you were before. And in the repair shop in the lower levels, Sergeant O'Hewn worked on a broken navigation unit, his scarred hands moving with practiced precision as he restored function to something that others had abandoned as beyond saving a young Deshan child visiting the station. Tugged on Counselor Mavis's robe and asked her what made humans special among all the species in the galaxy. Metis looked down at the curious young face and remembered a small notch carved into the base of a metal cane, a detail included by a blind man because a blind girl had told him it mattered. They break, she said softly. Everyone breaks. And that is simply part of living in a universe that does not always care about our feelings or our hopes. She paused and smiled. But humans, she continued, have learned something that the rest of us are only beginning to understand. The child waited with wide eyes for the answer. Humans never stay broken, Mavis said. And more than that, they help others learn how to rebuild. And that is a gift more valuable than any technology or weapon or ancient wisdom. They teach the galaxy that damage is not destiny. And that is perhaps the most remarkable thing any species has ever offered to the stars. And somewhere in the corridors of Threshold 7, a metal cane tapped its steady rhythm, carrying a girl who had lost everything forward into a future she was building one step at a time. Word spread through the human section of Threshold 7 the way fire spreads through dry grass. Quietly at first, and then with a speed that surprised everyone. Story was simple, but it touched something deep in every human who heard Ida. Blind orphan girl had been attacked by Valtteri youths who broke her only connection to her dead father. And instead of crying or seeking revenge, she had sat in silent dignity until help came. And now a veteran who had lost his own sight had crafted her a cane that could never be broken. The humans of the station did not hold meetings to discuss what had happened. They did not organize protests or demand justice from the station administrators. They simply began to appear wherever Yuna went with her new metal cane. There were humans nearby, an engineer fixing a panel that did not really need fixing, a teacher walking the same corridor on her way to somewhere unspecified, a dock worker taking a break in an unusual location, a retired ship captain sitting on a bench reading a data pad that he never seemed to scroll. They never spoke to the Velthari who passed by. They never threatened or postured or made any aggressive gestures. They simply existed, present and watching. A silent statement that required no words to understand. This child is not alone anymore. Counselor Mavis observed this phenomenon with growing fascination, her empathic senses detecting a complex web of emotions that linked the scattered human population like threads in an invisible tapestry. There was anger. Yes, a deep burning outrage at what had been done to one of their most vulnerable members. But there was something else beneath the anger. Something far more interesting to her scholarly mind. There was resolve. She began researching human history through the station's data archives, digging through records that most galactic species had dismissed as irrelevant. And what she found kept her awake through several night cycles. Humans were not a species that simply recovered from setbacks. They were a species that transformed setbacks into fuel. Every disaster in their history had led to innovation. Every defeat had planted seeds of future victory. Every cruelty inflicted upon them had been catalogued and remembered and eventually answered. Sometimes generations later, when the original perpetrators had long forgotten what they had done, and Mavis found herself looking at the human community with new eyes, seeing not a small population of primitive newcomers, but something far more complex and potentially far more dangerous. The Velthari trade official named Vorak learned of his son's actions through a report filed by a station security officer who had noticed the increased human presence in certain corridors. Vorak was not concerned about the harm done to a human orphan, because in his culture, the strong dominated the weak, and that was simply the natural order of things. What concerned him was the attention. He went to the repair shop in the lower levels to address the problem directly, bringing 2 of his clan guards for intimidation. And he found the blind human soldier working calmly at his bench, as if he had been expecting this visit. "You are causing problems," Vorak said without greeting or ceremony. "Your people are gathering in ways that make my son uncomfortable." Knowing did not look up from his work because looking up would have been meaningless anyway. "Your son broke an orphan's cane," he replied, his voice as calm as still water. "I gave her a new one. And that is the extent of my involvement. You've stirred up the human population against my family. I have done nothing of the kind." Vorak stepped closer, trying to use his larger size to intimidate, forgetting that such tactics were useless against someone who could not see. "I am an important official on this station," he said, lowering his voice to a threatening hiss. "I can have your shop closed, your residence revoked, and your presence on Threshold 7 terminated." Dahyun set down his tools and turned toward the Velthari official, his scarred face expressionless, but his posture shifting in a subtle way that made the 2 guards suddenly uncertain. "Your son destroyed a child's only memento of her dead father," Dahyun said, each word precise and cold. "The child I helped was an orphan with no one to protect her. And your son chose her specifically because she was vulnerable. That is how strength establishes itself in proper society. That is not how it works among humans." "You are threatening me." Dahyun shook his head slightly. "I am explaining something to you," he said. "Among my people, when someone harms a child, it is not forgotten, and it is not forgiven easily. And it certainly is not something that the community ignores." Vorak's scales shifted in an unconscious display of unease. "What do you want?" "I want nothing from you." "Then why are your people following my son?" "They are not following your son," Dahyun said. "They are watching over a child who was hurt, and there is a difference. And if your son feels uncomfortable in their presence, perhaps he should consider why that might be." Vorak stood in confused silence for a long moment because nothing in his experience had prepared him for this kind of confrontation. Velthar conflicts were resolved through dominance displays. through threats and counter-threats that established clear hierarchies. But this human was not threatening him exactly. And yet Varrock felt more unsettled than he had ever felt facing an armed opponent. "This is not over," he said finally, falling back on a phrase that felt inadequate even as he spoke it. "No," Dahyan agreed. "It is not over because your son has not yet understood what he did. And until he understands, nothing can be over." The trade official left with his guards, and word of the confrontation spread through the station almost as quickly as the original story had spread. Humans began to walk a little taller in the corridors. Velthari began to give them a little more room, and young Thesek, son of Varrock, found himself unable to sleep as the strange sickness in his stomach grew stronger each day. He had expected consequences in the form of punishment or retaliation, things he understood and could respond to in the manner his culture had taught him. Instead, he faced something far worse. He faced the quiet presence of humans who watched him without anger, without threats, without any of the behaviors that would have allowed him to respond with righteous aggression. They simply looked at him as if they were waiting for something, and he did not know what that something was. One night cycle, Thesek left his family quarters and wandered the station alone, trying to escape the weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders. Found himself in the same corridor where he had broken the wooden cane. And there he stopped and stood in the exact spot where a blind human girl had sat in silent dignity after he had destroyed her most precious possession. He remembered her face, calm and still even as her world fell apart around her. He remembered her voice asking him to give the cane back. Not demanding or begging, just asking. He remembered the sound of wood snapping and the laughter of his companions, and the hollow feeling that had followed when the human refused to provide the satisfaction he had expected. Thesek did not understand what was happening to him, and his culture had no words for it, and his father would be ashamed if he knew. But standing alone in that corridor, the young Velthari felt something shifting inside him, something that wanted to break free from the rigid structure of dominance and submission that had shaped his entire life. He needed to find the human girl. He needed to stand before her and discover what happened next, because whatever this feeling was, it would not leave him alone until he faced it directly. And Thesek was beginning to suspect that facing it was the only way forward from the cage he had built around himself. The repair shop sat in the lower levels of Threshold 7, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors minded their own business, which suited Sergeant Jang Do-yoon perfectly. He had spent 15 years in the human military before a plasma explosion took his sight during a battle he rarely spoke about. And now he spent his days fixing things that others had given up on: broken navigation units, damaged life support components, old weapons that no longer fired straight. They all found their way to his small shop where his scarred hands worked magic through touch alone. Do-yoon received the message from Counselor Mavis while he was rebuilding a cooling unit for a Deshan merchant, and he paused his work to consider the brief communication: "She needs help." 3 words that told him almost nothing, and yet somehow told him everything he needed to know. Mavis was not someone who sent messages lightly, and if she believed someone needed him specifically, then there was a reason. For Ith finished his current repair, cleaned his tools, and made his way through the station using a combination of his cybernetic implants that mapped his surroundings through sonar and the old-fashioned training he had received years ago when he first learned to navigate without sight. The maintenance corridor was easy to find, and when he arrived, he immediately detected the small figure sitting against the wall, her breathing slow and steady, and her heartbeat calm despite whatever had happened. To her, he could tell she was young, from the pitch of her breathing and the size of the heat signature his implants detected. He could tell she was blind from the Wei Shi turned her head toward sounds rather than toward visual stimuli, and he could tell she was human from the particular rhythm of her heartbeat. That distinctive pattern that he had learned to recognize among all the alien signatures on this station. Doyen approached slowly and then lowered himself to the floor beside her. Leaving a respectful distance between them, he did not speak immediately. Just sat in comfortable silence and waited. "Who are you?" the girl asked after a long moment. "Someone who understands dark places," Dohyun replied. The girl was quiet, and he could sense her evaluating his words, measuring them against whatever internal scale she used to judge the beings she encountered. "You are human," she said finally. You are blind." He smiled slightly at her. "Perception. How did you know?" "You turned your head toward my voice the same way I do. And your footsteps sounded careful in the way that sighted people's footsteps do not. You have good instincts," Dohyun said. "My name is Dohyun, and I was a soldier once before I lost my sight. My name is Yuna. Someone told me you might need help." "Yuna." Another long pause, and then the girl's calm facade cracked just slightly, her voice carrying a weight of grief that she had been holding back. "They broke my cane," she whispered. "Some Veltari boys took it and snapped it and threw the pieces down a waste chute." Dohyun felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest, the protective fury that rose in him whenever he heard of the strong tormenting the weak, but he kept his voice calm, because he understood that what this girl needed was not his anger but something else entirely. "Tell me about the cane," he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean, tell me everything you can remember about it." Every detail, no matter how small. Yuna was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming softer and more distant, as if she were traveling back in time to better days. "My father carved it from a tree on our home world," she began. "It was a type of wood that was very hard and smooth, and he spent 3 days shaping it because he wanted it to be perfect for me." Dohyun listened without interrupting. "The handle was wrapped with cord because my hands were small and he did not want me to lose my grip. And the cord was blue because that was my mother's favorite color." "What else?" "There was a small notch near the bottom," Yuna continued. "I made it by accident when I struck a rock too hard while I was learning to use the cane. And I was upset because I thought I had ruined my father's gift. But he laughed and said that the notch made it truly mine now." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Dohyun felt his heart ache for this child who had lost everything and then lost the last piece of everything. "I can smell the workshop on you," Yuna said suddenly. "Metal and oil and something else, something that burns." "Solder," Dohyun confirmed. "I repair things for a living. Can you repair my cane?" The hope in her voice was so fragile that Dohyun wished with all his heart that he could say yes. But the pieces were gone, recycled into raw materials that were probably already being reformed into something else entirely. "I cannot bring back what was lost," he said honestly. "But I can make something new if you will trust me. Something new. A cane that will never break. No matter who tries to break it." Yuna considered this for a long moment. "It would not be the same." "No," Dohyun agreed. "It would not be the same, and nothing can replace what your father made for you. But perhaps there is room in your heart for something else alongside that memory." 3 days later, Dohyun sent a message to the human quarters, asking Yuna to visit his shop. She arrived guided by a young human woman who volunteered at the refugee center. And Dohyun thanked the escort and then led Yuna to his workbench where the new cane waited. He placed it in her hands without ceremony and let her explore it through touch. The way they both understood the world, the shaft was forged from salvaged hull metal, an alloy designed to withstand the stresses of space travel, and it would not break even if someone tried to snap it with their full strength. The grip was wrapped not in cord, but in leather cut from Dohyun's old military jacket. The same jacket he had worn the day he lost his sight. And it was worn soft and smooth from years of use. Inside the shaft, he had installed a sonic emitter, a simple device that would pulse gentle vibrations through the cane, mapping the surroundings in a way that Yuna would learn to read with time. And at the base, where the cane met the floor, he had carved a small notch. Yuna's fingers found the notch and stopped there, trembling slightly. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remembered." She stood holding the cane in silence, and Doyun could hear her breathing change as emotions moved through her. "I cannot pay you for this," she said finally. "I did not ask for payment." "Then, why did you make it for me?" Doyun reached out and placed his scarred hand over her small one where it gripped the handle. "Because someone helped me once when I was lost in darkness," he said. "And the only payment they asked was that I help someone else when the time came. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything." Yuna lifted the cane and held it against her chest the way a child might hold a treasured toy. And Doyun felt something warm and bright bloom in his chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. "There is something I want you to remember," he said. 3 words that I was told when I lost my sight and thought my life was over. "What words?" Doyun leaned closer and spoke quietly, as if sharing a secret that was meant only for her. "Never stay broken." Yuna repeated the words softly to herself, and then she smiled for the first time since they had met. And the smile transformed her face from something wounded into something luminous and watching from the entrance to the shop. A young Velthari named Thesek saw the gift given and the words spoken, and something twisted in his stomach that he did not understand. Something that felt like sickness but was actually the first stirring of conscience. Councillor Mavis had lived for nearly 300 years, which was considered middle age for a Theshan. And in that time, she had witnessed countless acts of cruelty and kindness across dozens of worlds. Her species possessed a gift that others often called a curse, the ability to perceive emotional states as visible colors and patterns that surrounded every living being like a second skin. Fear appeared as jagged lines of sickly yellow, anger burned in violent shades of crimson, and despair hung like heavy clouds of gray that seemed to pull the very light out of the air around a person. Mavis had been walking through the maintenance corridors on her way to a diplomatic meeting when she heard the voices ahead, and she had quickened her pace but arrived too late to prevent what happened. She had watched from a distance as the Velthari youths surrounded the small human girl, had seen the emotional colors shift and swirl around the group as dominance and cruelty played out in their ancient dance. The Velthari radiated the bright aggressive orange of those seeking to establish status, while their victim should have shown the colors that Mavis expected to see in such situations. But the human girl's aura was unlike anything Mavis had ever witnessed when the cane was taken from her hands. There was a spike of fear, yes, a brief flash of yellow that was perfectly natural and expected when the wood snapped and the pieces were thrown away. There was grief, a deep blue that welled up from somewhere inside the child's heart. But beneath these surface emotions, Mavis saw something that made her stop breathing for a moment. There was a core of light within this child that refused to demit was not the harsh brightness of rage or the cold glow of hatred seeking revenge. It was something else entirely, something warm and steady like a flame that had learned to burn even in the strongest winds. The child was not suppressing her pain or hiding her feelings the way some species learned to do. She was transforming them into something else, turning grief into resolve and fear into quiet determination of ease. Watched as the human girl sat down against the wall after her tormentors left, and the counselor found herself unable to look away from the extraordinary display of emotional alchemy happening before her eyes in 3 centuries of reading auras across the galaxy. She had never seen anything quite like this. She approached slowly, her soft footsteps barely making any sound on the metal floor, and she saw the girl's head turn slightly in her direction. "I know someone is there," the child said. "I can hear you breathing. You have sharp ears," Mavis replied gently, lowering herself to sit on the floor at a respectful distance from the girl. "My name is Counselor Mavis, and I saw what happened to you. You did not help." There was no accusation in the words. Just a simple statement of fact made Mavis feel a deep shame she had not experienced in many decades. "I arrived too late to stop them," she admitted, "and I'm sorry for that failure." The girl nodded slowly, accepting this explanation without demanding more. "My name is Yuna," she said. "That is a beautiful name." "Yuna, and I would like to help you now if you will allow me." Yuna's head tilted slightly, and Mavis realized the child was listening to more than just her words, perhaps sensing tone and intention in ways that sighted beings often overlooked. "Why would you help me?" Yuna asked. "I am just a human, and humans are not important in galactic society." The words struck Mavis with surprising force because they revealed how much this child had already learned about her people's place in the larger universe. Humans were indeed considered unimportant by most galactic standards. They had only discovered faster than light travel within the last century, making them infants compared to civilizations that had sailed between stars for millennia. They came from a harsh world full of predators and natural disasters, what some species called a death world. Yet they lacked the natural weapons or armor that such environments usually produced. They were small and soft and short-lived, rarely reaching even a single century of age. And many in the Galactic Council questioned whether they should even be granted full membership among the starfaring peoples. But sitting here in this cold corridor, looking at the remarkable light that burned within this blind orphan child, Mavis began to suspect that the Council had fundamentally misunderstood what made a species worthy. "May I ask you something, Yuna?" "Yes, those who hurt you. They wanted you to cry and beg, and yet you did neither. And instead you sat down calmly and waited," Mavis said. "How did you do that?" Yuna was quiet for a moment, and her small hands folded together in her lap. "My father taught me something before he died," she said finally. "He told me that being scared is natural, and there is no shame in feeling fear when bad things happen. But letting fear decide what I do is different. And that is when I give my power to someone else." Mavis felt the words settle into her understanding like stones dropping into still water. "They broke my cane," Yuna continued, her voice steady despite the grief that Mavis could see swirling beneath her calm surface. "That cane was all I had left of my father, and now it is gone forever. And that hurts more than I can say. And yet you remain unbroken." "They broke a thing that I loved," Yuna said simply. "They did not break me, and there is a difference." Mavis sat with this truth for a long moment, turning it over in her ancient mind, and finding depths of wisdom that she had not expected. From one so young, this was not the ignorant stubbornness of a child who did not understand her situation. This was something else. A philosophy of resilience that seemed to run through this human girl like iron running through stone. "I would like to help you return to your quarters," Mavis said finally. "And I would also like to contact someone who might be able to assist you further." "Who?" "A human who lives on this station. A man who I believe will understand your situation better than most." Yuna considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I would appreciate help returning to my quarters," she said. "I cannot navigate safely without my cane." Mavis rose and offered her hand, feeling the small warm fingers wrap around her own with a trust that felt like a gift as she guided Yuna through the corridors toward the human section of the station. Mavis composed a message in her mind to an old acquaintance, a quiet man who ran a repair shop in the lower levels and who she knew had his own experience with darkness. His name was Sergeant Jang Do-yoon, and he had lost his sight in combat many years ago. but had found ways to not just survive, but to thrive in a universe that was not designed for those who could not. Mavis transmitted the message through her neural implant, including Yuna's location and only 3 words of explanation. She needs help. She did not know what to do with this information, but she had a feeling, a hope really, that this broken situation might somehow lead to something that was not broken at all. And as she walked with the small human girl through the winding passages of Threshold 7, Mavis found herself thinking about the nature of strength and where it truly came from. It was not size or natural weapons or ancient technology. It was something far more mysterious and perhaps far more powerful. It was the ability to face destruction and refuse to be destroyed, and watching the steady light that burned within this blind orphan child, Mavis began to understand that humanity might be far more remarkable than anyone in the galaxy had yet realized. The corridor smelled like recycled air and metal, the same smell that filled every corner of Threshold 7. The massive orbital station that served as home to refugees from dozens of worlds. Yuna walked slowly through the maintenance passage, a wooden cane tapping against the floor in a steady rhythm that told her everything she needed to know about the space around her. She was 12 years old, human, and blind since birth. The cane in her hand was not fancy or special to anyone who might look at it, but to Yuna, it was the most precious thing in the universe because her father had carved it from a tree on their home world 3 days before the raiders came and destroyed everything. Now her father was gone. Her mother was gone. Her whole colony was gone. And this simple wooden cane was all she had left of them. The station housed thousands of refugees from many different species, and humans were among the smallest groups here, considered primitive newcomers by the older galactic civilizations that had traveled between stars for thousands of years, had learned to navigate the station by counting her steps and memorizing the sounds that different areas made. And she had become quite good at finding her way to the food distribution center and back to her small sleeping quarters in the human section. But today she had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now she found herself in an unfamiliar corridor, where the echoes sounded different and the air felt colder. She stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to figure out which direction would lead her back to the main passages. That was when she heard them approaching. There were 4 of them, their footsteps heavy and their scales making a soft scraping sound against the floor that told Yuna exactly what species they were of Ulthari. The reptilian beings who dominated much of this sector of the station with their loud voices and aggressive behavior. Yuna had encountered Velthari before and knew that their society was built on dominance and submission, where the strong ruled and the weak were expected to bow down and show their throats in surrender. She tightened her grip on her cane and kept her face calm even though her heart began to beat faster. The footsteps stopped in front of her, and she could smell the particular scent that Velthari carried, something like copper and dry sand. "Look what we found," a young voice said in the common galactic language, and Yuna could hear the cruel amusement in his tone. "A human, and a broken one at that." "I am not broken," Yuna said quietly. Keeping her voice steady, laughter erupted from the group, harsh and mocking. "It cannot even see," another voice said. "How does it survive without proper senses? With this primitive stick," the first voice replied. And Yuna felt a rough-scaled hand grab the top of her cane. What a pathetic species. Needing tools just to walk, Yuna held onto her cane tightly, her knuckles turning white with the effort. "Please let go," she said. "This belonged to my father." "Your father," the leader repeated, and his voice turned colder. "Where is your father now?" "Little human. He's dead." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Yuna hoped that perhaps this information would make them leave her alone, that some small piece of compassion might exist even in these cruel hearts. Instead, the leader laughed again. So you are an orphan with a dead father's stick, and you think you can stand before me without showing proper respect. In Velthari culture, a weaker being was supposed to kneel and expose their throat when confronted by a stronger one. And Yuna knew this, but she did not move because her father had taught her that dignity was something no one could take unless she gave it away. I mean, no disrespect, she said calmly. I am simply trying to return to my quarters. Kneel, the leader commanded. No. The single word seemed to shock the group into silence for a moment, and Yuna could hear their breathing change, becoming faster and more aggressive. What did you say to me? The leader hissed. I said no, Yuna repeated. I will not kneel because I have done nothing wrong, and kneeling is not part of my culture. The scaled hand yanked the cane from her grip with sudden violence, and Yuna stumbled forward, losing her balance without the familiar support. You dare to refuse me, the leader snarled. I am Thesek of the Vorn clan, and no primitive soft-skin will disrespect me in front of my companions. Yuna heard the cane being passed between the group, heard their claws scraping against the wood that her father's hands had shaped with such care and love. Give it back, she said, and for the first time her voice trembled slightly. Please. It is all I have left of him. This worthless thing, Thesek said with contempt. This is what your father left you, a stick carved by primitive hands. It is not worthless to me. Then let me show you what I think of human sentiment. The sound that followed would stay with Yuna for the rest of her life, a sharp crack as the cane was snapped in half. Then another crack as those halves were broken again. Then the clatter of pieces hitting the floor and sliding away. Gather them up, Thesek ordered his companions, and Yuna heard them moving around her, collecting the fragments of her father's final gift. There is a waste chute at the end of this corridor, one of them said. Perfect. Yuna stood frozen as she heard footsteps moving away from her, heard the hiss of the waste chute opening, heard the pieces of her cane tumbling down into the recycling system, where they would be broken down into raw materials and reformed into something else entirely. Her father's hands had touched that wood, had spent hours carving it smooth, had wrapped the handle with cord so that her small fingers would not slip, and now it was gone forever. Velthari returned and surrounded her again, and Yuna knew they were waiting for her to cry, to beg, to show the weakness they expected from someone in her position. She did not cry, she did not beg. Instead, she carefully lowered herself to the floor and sat with her back against the cold metal wall, folding her hands in her lap and keeping her face perfectly still. What are you doing? Thesek demanded, confusion entering his voice. I am waiting, Yuna said simply. Waiting for what? For whatever comes next. The Velthari shifted uncomfortably, their scales scraping against each other as they exchanged glances that Yuna could not see but could somehow sense. Through their uncertain movements, this was not how victims were supposed to behave. They were supposed to weep and grovel and provide satisfaction to those who had dominated them. But this small blind human girl simply sat in silence with a face as calm as still water. Let us go, one of the companions said nervously. Someone might come. This is not over, Thesek hissed at Yuna. But his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Their footsteps retreated down the corridor, fading into the distance until Yuna was alone with nothing but the hum of the station's life support systems and the echo of her own steady breathing. She sat there in the darkness that was her constant companion, unable to move safely without her cane, unable to find her way back to the human section. But she did not cry out for help. She did not let the tears fall. Her father had told her once that being scared was perfectly acceptable because fear was natural and healthy. But letting fear make decisions was something else entirely, something that gave power to those who wanted to hurt you. They broke my cane, Yuna thought to herself. But they did not break me, and from the shadows at the end of the corridor, Someone watched the small human girl who sat so still and quiet in the aftermath of cruelty. And that someone began to understand something important about the newest species to reach the galactic stage.